Trouble with Peace by Joe Abercrombie. Published in September of 2020. Book 2 of the Age of Madness Trilogy. As a new king assumes the throne in Adua, and a truce is struck between the North and the Union, an era of peace seems to have dawned in the circle of the world. But peace breeds restlessness. Restlessness breeds discontent. And unchecked discontent oft boils over. Warlike men yet thirst for conquest. And absent enemies from without, the Union may yet burn at the hands of those within. Hi everyone, welcome back to Zio's Book Club once again, and today we're here to talk about The Trouble with Peace by Joe Abercrombie. Book 2 of the Age of Madness Trilogy, and depending on whether or not you count the short story collection Sharp Ends, either Book 8 or Book 9 of the collective First Law sequence. Now, I'm going to do something a little different than I've done before here on Zio's Book Club, and that is that this review, if you want to call it, really I think of it more as kind of a discussion. I said something similarly when I reviewed A Little Hatred, the previous book last year. More of a discussion, but this is going to be a full spoiler discussion from minute one. I'm not gonna, I don't think that anyone anywhere in the world will be have read, The Blade itself, Before They're Hanged, Last Argument of Kings, Best Served Cold, The Hero's Red Country, and A Little Hatred, and be like, well, I think I'll check YouTube. I'll look at some reviews to see if I want to read The Trouble with Peace. No, if you're interested in reading The Trouble with Peace, I think you've probably read The Trouble with Peace, all right? And or more maybe looking for a discussion than a whether or not you should read it review. So this is a full spoiler discussion from the word go. I'll be launching right into everything through the last paragraph of the last page is game. It is fair game for the entirety of this review, all right? So with that said, I have 9 points of discussion in honor of this being the 9th book. But before we get too into those, let's just do a quick little synopsis of the whole book. Just to sum it all, I give the 30-second sum up of what The Trouble with Peace is about before we launch too heavy into it. So, Leo Dan Brock, having secured England's victory and eventual truce with the North and the forces of now the King of the North, Stour Nightfall, is arranged to be married to Savine Dan Glocta, who he knocked up in their one-night stand near the end of A Little Hatred. They're arranged in a little arranged marriage by their mothers for a little political alliance, and Leo is roped in by a few scheming lords of the Open Council into a rebellion against the newly crowned King Orso. Savine gets in on it. They organize allies. They plan a big old rebellion, big old civil war against the king, and they are curb stomped, crushed, blown out of the water, obliterated, battle won, rebellion over. The lords of the Open Council who planned it all hanged. Leo loses a leg, humiliated, laid low, life imprisonment, Orso says, and then at the end of the book, the Breakers, who played a bigger role in the first book, Little Hatred, led by Judge and Reesenow, the kind of more militant Occupy Wall Street of the circle of the world, they're back at it. And yep, that's pretty much how The Trouble with Peace goes down. So, point of discussion number 1, expectations versus reality. In this case, fictional reality, but you know what I mean. And so I talked about this when I reviewed A Little Hatred last year. It was a book that actually, for what was supposed to be book 1 of a trilogy, it wrapped up surprisingly thoroughly, I thought. It wasn't exactly like a Fellowship of the Ring where the one ring is still out there looking to be destroyed. No, it felt like the wars between Adua and the North and Stour Nightfall and the Breakers in Valbec both pretty much kind of resolved. So I was left going into The Trouble with Peace not really knowing what was going to happen, but perhaps having things I wanted to happen that maybe in most cases didn't happen. And, I guess you can't really judge on a work of art harshly for not living up to your expectations, especially if it's, in a deconstructionist style fantasy like this book and this trilogy and this whole collective First Law series. But I don't know, at the same time, there was part of me was a little disappointed that we're just right back into the war again. Obviously, war is, it's baked into almost all, like, high fantasy, epic fantasy from... Do I really need to go into the series? I would just be going through and naming every fantasy series from, Lord of the Rings to Narnia to Harry Potter to A Song of Ice and Fire to Stormlight Archive to basically everything else. That war is, but we were back into it so quickly. It just felt like we had already kind of wrapped up these wars a couple hundred pages earlier at the end of A Little Hatred, and now we're back into this Civil War. So I don't know. Part of me was a little bit underwhelmed by that. I got to admit, maybe I wanted... we had this Leo Dambrock, Stour Nightfall kind of truce alliance. Them, meeting in their camp after their medical tent after their duel, and saying maybe we can be friends. Maybe, grabbing hands, shaking hands, and I don't know. Maybe there's part of me that wanted a little bit of Goku Vegeta style action there, right? Like I don't know. I didn't want him to necessarily go full fantasy cheese theme and go on an adventure and fight like a Dark Lord together, but I wish there had been maybe a little bit more of that. I mean, they did have scenes together in this book. Diplomacy, Leo trying to rope Stour into the rebellion that he's been roped into by Aisher and Berezin, I think his name was, and then some scenes together where they're on the road to the war and stuff. But then they didn't really have any scenes together in the big war sequence at the end that occupied about a tenth or so of the book's runtime. So I was a little disappointed by that. I wanted to see more Leo and Stour. I thought that Abercrombie worked hard to build that relationship through the first book, into their duel, into the aftermath of the duel, and I was a little underwhelmed by that, the way that we went right back into war. But I don't know, I guess it's my bad to expect a traditional adventure, from this series. Obviously it's not really what it's about, but it's not entirely what it's not about either. I would say that both the Logan, Jazal, Pharaoh, Baez team and Before They Are Hanged, that's an adventure story, right? And Red Country is definitely I would put it in the adventure genre. So I don't know. Maybe I'd kind of hope for something a little bit different than right back into the war, and was a little right back into it. We got to do it. Got to do it again. So my expectations maybe were kind of a little bit came short of there, I got to admit. But I suppose that subverted expectations do play a role in the story also, both our kind of interpretation of it and within the world of the book. Because, think about it. The book is about, a dashing young hero rising up against a king who's perceived to be corrupt, right? Marshaling together, an army of scoundrels and warriors and a likable ne'er-do-wells at his back to ride across the sea and, find secure justice and take out a corrupt regime, and they're crushed. They're curb stomped. They're blown out of the water. It's not a fight. It's barely. It's a fight, I guess. It's not a war, really. It all starts and ends really in the span of one day, right? The day of the big battle outside Stauffenbeck, I think the town was called. I could be off on that, but I think it was Stauffenbeck. So within the world of the novel, also, if the expectations are not met, Savine's viewpoint chapter is clear about that when she watches, even as the battle begins, doesn't even begin yet. The rebel armies march across the field towards the enemy, and they already fall apart. They come in at the wrong times. They get broken on the rivers. It's a mess. It's a disaster for the rebels, and it's unusual, in the epic fantasy genre. Or, sci-fi, fantasy, space opera, blow fantasy, anything like that, for the rebellion to be crushed so immediately and so effortlessly. Shouldn't say effortlessly, there was a fight, but so immediately, definitely. Point of discussion number 2, mysteries, the solved and the forgotten. So, to be honest, through the vast majority of this book, I did not even think about the Weaver, the head of the Breakers, or the head of the judge is the head of the Burners, right? The Weaver would be the head of the Breakers, the militant Occupy Wall Street from Val Beck, right? I wasn't really thinking about it. I'd largely kind of forgotten about that subplot, to be honest. Wrapped up more in the rebellion and everything surrounding that. But at the end of the book, last chapter, when I certainly wasn't really thinking about it at all, we get the reveal that the Weaver is Pike, aka Salem Ruse, who is in that the subject of that torture scene way, 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 way back at I think it might have been chapter 2 of The Blade itself, the very first law book. And he's back now, and well, he was back in the previous book, A Little Hatred, where in my review I talked about how I was a little surprised that he's still around. Shouldn't he be like ancient at this point? He was already like a veteran and like a member of high society, and way back in the beginning of A Blade itself, so he couldn't have been that young then. I would picture him, my age at least, mid-30s, right? So now he must be like 70 something. He's still like this tough military leader. I don't know, but but setting aside age little quibbles, but yeah, he seems to be in a sense the big bad maybe of this whole trilogy with this reveal. I don't know. Not that the Breakers don't have some noble causes. We got the likable characters such as Broad with them, but perhaps a less than savory means they may use from time to time, as we saw in the Valbeck Uprising. But yeah, it's pretty interesting. I kind of had pegged Pike as a more minor kind of a side character as we got into these later books. He appeared in Red Country, and I was like, that's cool. There's Pike. He appeared in the last book, and I was like, there's Pike again. Nice little cameo. That's fun. And now it's not a cameo no more, right? He's Arch Lecter, right? He's the head of the Weaver, and he's set to be a very, very, very major player going into Book 3, now called The Wisdom of Crowds, I believe, and I'll discuss the little title change there in a minute. But so that's interesting. I sure didn't see it coming. Didn't occur to me on any level. But there are also a couple of mysteries that felt kind of unresolved to me. The big one, if I had one expectation going into this book, it was that a significant mystery was going to be what the fuck happened to King Jezal, who killed him. Obviously, I think me and most other readers would have our expectations that it was Baez for whatever reason, but it's not addressed in a single line in this book, and that was a little strange, I thought. I mean, it wasn't explored in the slightest. Was not explored. I thought it was going to be a major, like, what happened? He's like a relatively healthy guy doing his fencing and everything in his 50s, right? Dead in his bed. What happened? But I don't know. They don't. Joe Abercrombie does not address this at all. I hope it's mentioned in book 3. I'll be a little underwhelmed if, like, one of the tripod of like main characters from the initial trilogy, his death is totally unexplained. But okay. And one last little thing before we move on to the next subject: the explosion at Kernsbick's little engine disaster in the middle of the book. What was the deal there? Was that planned by the Breakers somehow, or was it a genuine accident? The Breakers just attacked afterward, or what was going on there? I don't know. Doesn't seem like that was never really addressed either. I was a little confused by it. I thought it was like a terrorist attack, but maybe it was an actual accident. Maybe I'm a fucking idiot. If anyone has a better idea than me, feel free to go in the comments and let me know what's going down. Point of discussion number 3. Magus, save the king. I'm going to discuss all the characters to some extent or another. Some maybe a little more briefly, but I wanted to specifically mention good old King Orso. He was already probably my favorite in the first book, even though he's kind of a loser, just because he was so self-deprecating, and I don't know, I guess I just dig that style of humor, that general vibe, and you would think, so he continued, and now he's the king, right? And it seems like it would be hard to make the king of the most powerful nation in the world the underdog, but they somehow pull it off just because he's still self-deprecating. There's instantly a rebellion against him. Not entirely sure why. We'll get into that, but there's this rebellion, bad reputation. People hate him. His closed council disrespects him. So he somehow still manages to be the underdog even as king. Perhaps also because we know from what happened to King Jezal at the end of the last argument of kings that Baez really does pull the strings, Valentin Balk. So maybe being the king is almost like it's a gilded cage at best in this world. It's kind of a trap, right? So he still continues to be the underdog, but he almost reminds me in this book of a gifted kid who is shit at public school, does terrible, and then when challenged more, does better because, early on he could barely get out of bed for anything. Lazy, seemingly stupid to like the outside observer. Can't face any decision, but when there's armies marching in their vast thousands to destroy his kingdom and supplant him, then suddenly he gets almost this manic energy, full of ideas, dominating like these wartime conversations, like that conversation in the tent with Leo Dan Brock, making alliances successfully, like with King Joppo in Styria, and this lazy lech, this nobody, just nobody, can't raise a finger to do anything in his life of luxury in the last book. Now he's just like this, he almost becomes this like self-deprecatingly like badass like wartime leader. When the masonry is collapsing around the soldiers, everyone else wants to flee. Even Gorst is panicking a little bit. He's just like chilling. He's just enjoying the situation and doing the hangings after. A little hint of brutality sneaks in that we never would have seen from Giselle, I think. I remember one line where Lady Wetterlant, whose son being hanged, kind of kicked this off, is like cursing him out, and he just says, "Who cares?" It's so like cruelly dismissive, but he continues. So the rise of Orso, I thought I found myself rooting for the monarch, right? And that shouldn't even work. I should be rooting for the underdogs, which he is to some extent. But and I found myself just liking the king. Who would have thunk it? And a King Chapo too. I'll mention just that one little chapter he was in. I think chilling with his boy toys and his Gurkish boy toys in his little hotel room there in the House of Pleasure. He is a pretty likable kind of side character. I'd hope to see a little more of him, and hopefully Monza Mercato in book 9 maybe. So yeah, I guess I liked all the kings. I liked the heads of state here. Even Stour Nightfall in a villainous asshole, you love to hate him sort of way, right? Point number 4. Cripples, bastards, and broken things. Pardon me for getting my Game of Thrones and your first law, but I couldn't resist the comparison because they're all here. You got your cripples and bastards for sure, and most characters in the first law are broken to some extent, aren't they? First, we'll talk about a bastard, if there ever was one. Savine Dan Glockta, aka Savine Dan Brock, I believe she would go by. It's interesting. I think that she, if you were to ask me who the villain of this book is, at least not the greater sequence, of course, of the first law, not even this trilogy, but this book, The Trouble with Peace, I guess I would have to go with Savine. Bayaz has too minor a role to consider him really the villain of this book, even though we know he's the ultimate villain. And Stour, he's going along with Savine's plan. He's basically being manipulated by her, right? So even if he's a murdering asshole, I can't consider him the villain of this book. And, Aisher and Leo to some extent, there's no way you can really argue. I think that Orso is the villain. I don't see how you can possibly see it like that unless you on the Wetterlant son's side of he shouldn't have been hanged for his rape and murder. I mean, I guess I would be against hangings like Orso is, but he ends up having to do what he has to do, right? So, but the reason I would say Savine is really the villain as opposed to Leo or even Aisher is because she's the one who's doing the backstabbing, right? Talking at Ricky. I have no fucking clue how to pronounce this character's name. Ricka. I'm just going to say Ricky. It's probably not right. I know it's not right. She's Ricky to me. That's how I read it in my brain when I was reading. I'm going to call her Ricky. How Savine backstabbed Ricky by offering Ufrith to Stour. And she's really the one doing the wheeling and dealing. And you can see kind of her lying about being the darling of the slums, basically. She does rescue Broad and the Broad family, but she's inflating her reputation and putting, thousands and thousands and thousands of men in the meat grinder, basically, because she wants to be one step higher than the Lady Governess of England. She wants the fucking throne, right? She's not happy being, one of like the maybe 10 most powerful people in the Union. She wants to be like basically number one through her husband Leo being the king, right? So I'd say that makes her the ultimate antagonist, right? But this is a morally gray saga for the most part. We have a few all bad and a couple kind of all goodish characters. I would say, Temple from Red Country is pretty much all good. But so Savine's not, she's not Saturday morning cartoon villain. We see, of course, her rescuing the Broad family. She does, to some extent, help the slum folk. And, of course, at the end, she puts her own life in jeopardy, and she does go back for Leo, and she did not have to. And we know from seeing in her head, in her viewpoint chapter, that she does it because in her own way, she loves him, and she feels the need to help him. So even if I see her as the antagonist, she's not the Dark Lord by any stretch of the imagination. And that's the kind of moral ambiguity that I think you would like in a book like this. If you like the first lie, you pretty much gotta like moral ambiguity, I think, right? And now that we've talked about a bastard, let's go right into a cripple, namely the young lion himself, Leo Dan Brock. And he starts the book slightly crippled, doesn't he? His leg is having some issues from his good old duel with Stour at the end of the last book. I shouldn't say at the end, more the later middle of the last book. But I felt like I was reading that, okay, he's going to get better as the book goes on. Maybe the infection will still bother him, and it did, right? But then he ends the book getting his fucking other leg crushed by a horse and amputated, becoming a true absolute cripple who can barely climb a few steps on crutches, right? So it's he's just getting worse. His status is getting worse and worse than every book. At this point, at this rate, by the end of book 3, he's going to lose his eyes as well, right? And then a hand. Just gonna get worse and worse. So, and kind of a disappointment also watching him basically get dumber and more easy to manipulate as the book goes on. Yeah, it's almost like a doofus. Just the adventures of the doofus. And it's a little bit disappointing to me because reviewing A Little Hatred last year, I said, other than being a bit bullheaded, this guy basically seems like kind of a straight up fantasy hero. You can look at my review, and I had praise for Leo Dan Brock. Obviously he's in the closet, deep in that closet, and he's a little bit bullheaded, but he seemed like a decent enough sort. Seemed like he had good intentions for his kingdom and his friends, and nope, now he's rising up against the king and helping arrange again, like Savine, the deaths of thousands in this big old rebellion. And so disappointing to Savine and Leo both, as my opinion of Orso went up, my opinion of them kind of declined. Sad to say. And then we got Ricky, the dogman's daughter, whose name I am no doubt terribly mispronouncing, but I'm just gonna go with how I said it in my mind as I read the book. She's kind of prominent in the first third or so of the book. Her long eyes going fucking crazy. She goes on an adventure to meet the witch Cowrib, and great to see her again, by the way. That was a nice little. I don't like when dead characters come back to life normally, but I thought that was a cool reveal. I was like, oh, there you go, from the utmost north, right? And she has this little trip, gets her face like all tattooed up, her eye. Was her eye plucked out? It was just like blinded, I think, but. Then, interestingly, she kind of seems like she recedes a little bit into the background after that. It seemed like a more secondary character as the novel went on, although the ending twists obviously did involve her a little bit with her taking over Carleon, so that was interesting, but I liked just the visual description of all the tattoos around her face and things all like shaved up and tatted up and dead eyes, and it was a kind of creepy, the visually arresting in kind of your mind's eyes, you picture it. But I did like her journey still. She unlike Leo and Savine, she stayed pretty likable, a little treacherous in her own right, but I don't think you can judge anyone too harshly for maybe a backstabbing Stour Nightfall a little bit, can you? He's an asshole, or arsehole, as they like to say in this book. Then you got good old Vic. I like to call her Vicky. In the book, it's either Vic or Victorine, fantasy made-up name. I like that. She's Vicky to me. She's good old Vicky Tufel. Like I said when I reviewed A Little Hatred, I don't know that she made a tremendously huge impact on me personality-wise, but, I'd say I liked her a little bit more here. I liked, I'll go into the whole Westport election thing a little later. I found some things about that a little strange, not badly written, just strange in the greater scheme of the narrative. but I liked her going into the camp and lying to the rebels at the end. And I guess really, if you think about it, she was the only of the 7 viewpoint characters on the King's side besides King Orso himself. The other 5 were on the rebel side, weren't they? Leo, Savine, Ricky. Well, she doesn't quite go along with it, but technically on the rebel side, Clover and Broad. So she represented, half of the King's side of the war well enough towards the end. Of course, she got the last chapter of the book, didn't she? So overall, personality-wise, she makes the least impact on me. Probably the 7 main characters here, but maybe I liked her a little bit more than A Little Hatred. Broad, I was actually a little I really liked Broad's arc in A Little Hatred, from this impoverished worker to eventually being this enforcer for Savine, one of the most feared women in the Union. But I don't know, he felt a little static here to me. He starts and ends the novel working for Savine in very similar ways, a little more static and very more secondary. I didn't count the page time between the 2 books or anything, but I felt like he was a little less prominent here. And then we had Jonas Clover. Obviously, my opinion of him plummeted when he killed Wonderful at the end of A Little Hatred, but I found him, he's just kind of serving as our viewpoint character into the North, basically into the Stowers camp. But he serves pretty well at that role. I mean, I'd say maybe I kind of came around him a little bit more in this book. Towards the end, he betrayed Wonderful last time, now I betray Stour. He's really he's a little bit of a disloyal guy. He's a little bit of a betrayer. But he had some real good lines. He's nicely cynical on his view of war throughout the book. I actually want to quote a line that for some reason really stuck in my head from early in the book, actually, one of the early Clover chapters. It's from when he tells one of his men to chop off some heads and stuff them in a sack to show to Stour Nightfall to prove that they did the job. And so his man says, I'll read it here, "Never thought of myself as a man who fills sacks with heads." And then the next line, "No one sets off in that direction," said Clover. "But before you know it, there you bloody are." For some reason, that just stuck out with me. You gotta love that Joe Abercrombie dialogue. Whatever little nitpicks I may have about the plot, can't complain about Abercrombie's dialogue. Always gets me. Point number 5. Real and gritty. So when I discussed A Little Hatred last year, I talked about how it was one of the lowest magic high fantasy novels I've probably ever read in my life. And actually, The Trouble with Peace doesn't bring back the magic. It pushes things further in that direction. In the entire 500-page run of this novel, the only magic I can think of being that's depicted at any point is Ricky's long eye going crazy in the first few chapters before Karib tattoos her up, and the eater strength we see in a couple occasions, shanked in one of Vicky's chapters, and of course Yoru Sulfur, that kind of terrorist attack thing with the breakers or burners toward the middle of the book. And those 2 things, the long eye and a little bit of eater strength, that is it. After Yoru Sulfur's eater strength display in the middle of the book, I don't think there is a single thing in any way supernatural at any point in the final 200 plus pages of the book. It's zero magic from that point on, and that's pretty unusual for a high fantasy book, isn't it? And there's that kind of realness and grittiness extends to the military battle depiction, as I would say too. Partially the use of cannons now, artillery, bringing that into it, the kind of gruesomeness of that, and how we see the aftermath of that, but also the spirit of the battles itself, even compared to previous books in the First Law sequence. I mean, if you think about you would consider previous First Law, except for the heroes, that one's pretty grim and muddy. But think about the wars in Last Argument of Kings, these battles between the forces of good and evil, more or less in the high places in the far north. The battles of the gates of Audua with the Eaters and Biaz's magic and stuff. Also in the Last Argument of Kings, even the last book, the battles of Leo Dambrock and Stour Nightfall had more of a fantasy good versus evil sort of flavor to them, a little more high drama, a little more traditional vibe to it. Certainly, even any other previous book in this series, I would say the battles were at least a little more kind of good versus evil, a little more magic in the midst, But in this one, it's just real muddy. It's real morally ambiguous, real depressing. People in the battle, we see the little people chapter, people thinking about they're being forced to kill people they don't hate and for a cause they don't believe in. Just pushing each other onto pikes in the mud, just dying by the hundreds for just bullshit. Just in these depressing little valley between some rivers, and in that sense, it's the grimmest, almost the grimmest of the grimdark. The grimmest depiction of battles and military matters, I would say, almost in this whole 9-book sequence, with the possible exception of some of the heroes. Point of discussion number 6, returning characters. And I just have them listed out here. We're just going to go through them. I mean, returning, obviously not new characters from the Little Hatred returning, but classic trilogy characters returning. One, the Dogman dies. Well, it's depressing, but maybe it's not the most depressing. He dies of old age. Maybe there was some kind of disease in the mix. It's not specific, but unlike Jazal, it doesn't really bother me because it's just a kind of an old man who passes away in his bed, beloved by all. I was sad, but I don't think it made sense for the story. And the funeral scene was actually quite nice. The speeches, honestly, I was reading them. I was like, these are lovely speeches. Ricky had a good one about her dad, but I actually liked Carl Shivers' best. I didn't write down the exact line like I did the Clover line, but he says something along the lines of, he didn't sing his own songs. He didn't need to. Every man and woman in the North knew his quality. And that popped, and that read true to me from everything we saw of his experiences with the fellow Northerners in the first Law trilogy. I was like, yep. So I was sad, but I wasn't disappointed. It made sense for the story. Sans Dan Glockta himself, Old Sticks, our favorite little torturer-in-chief. Really the core tripod of the original trilogy that's left around here. I feel like Joe Abercrombie underuses him a little bit, to be honest. He's such a great character. He could have made more use of him, but I liked the little bits we got of him. He seems to have more of a father-daughter relationship with Vic, really, than Savine by the end of the novel, or by the time he exits, which is a little more than halfway when he realizes that Savine is part of the plot against the Union. He says, I'm going to retire. I'm out of here. Going to go write a book about fencing. I was a little sad. I felt like he was a little underused, but I liked what we got with him. Pike, of course, returning. As I said, always surprised this good old fat Salem ruse from the beginning of the Blade itself was our main villain. That's interesting. We'll see how it plays out. Bremer Dan Gorst, definitely awesome. Gotta love Gorst. He must be getting his 50, maybe close to 60 now, right? If we think about the time gap in the series at this point, still just brutalizingly, overpoweringly strong compared to basically everyone else. I could be the best fighter in the whole circle of the world at this point. Maybe if he fought Stour, because Stour is so much younger, it would have been a good battle. But now that Stour has 10 knee tendons all sliced apart. Who the fuck in this world, besides maybe an eater, could beat Gorst? From what we've seen, doesn't seem like anyone. He still's got that high-pitched voice. Gotta love Gorst. Never not delighted to see him on screen. Never. Always, even the heroes, even when he's having his sarcastic thoughts, dig every single bit with Gorst. But while Gorst continues to be a badass, we have Finri, Dan Brock, and Artie, Glockta's wife, previously Jazal's Boo. There's this interesting arc, I feel like, particularly with Finri, where she's like this kind of like smug, like pleased with herself, not in a malicious way, but just like, oh, I'm so good at this little playing the game thing. Great little military commander organizing this marriage between Savine and Leo. And we get to see that almost depressingly, it just blows up in her face. She's begging Leo, this was all a terrible idea. Don't go to this war. Please don't do this. This was a disaster. And she's right. And it's almost depressing. It's like she genuinely did have the good idea of this arranged marriage in the novel, which made sense if only Leo hadn't been such an idiot, basically. So we got Baez back pretty briefly. He's still Baez. Like Gorst, I like every bit we ever see of him because he's such an evil prick, right? But it makes sense that we don't see a ton of him. It's disappointing, but at the same time, I kind of understand that's a Baez story wasn't what Abercrombie wanted to tell here. Carl Shivers still also must be 50, mid-50s, but still probably not quite as good a fighter as Gorst, but he's got to be pretty high up there from how we see he dominates that duel against his fellow old dudes when Ricky sends him on in. Still pretty hard to beat, still like him. He's softened up a little bit. That's directly addressed in the book, that he's softened up since the time of the heroes. It's funny that really his only viewpoint character chapters have still been in Best Served Cold, but he's been one of the steady presences through this whole sequence, hasn't he? And finally, not a character exactly, but I want to address the Shenka, our good old northern orcs that have played only a minor, seemed more important at the very beginning of this whole sequence in the Blade itself than they've become. But they make a couple appearances here. They still exist, it turns out. Good old Shenka. Point of discussion number 7. You can't beat City Hall. So, I talked about this before, way back towards the beginning of this little discussion, but so the book is interestingly structured in that I would say probably it must be about a third or so of the total page time is dedicated to building and planning and structuring and organizing and waging this rebellion, right? By Aisher initially, then Berezine, then Leo, and then finally Savine, and trying to wrap the Breakers and the North and everyone else into it. The Stour Nightfall, his guys, trying for the Styrians, King Joppo, maybe it doesn't quite work, but so much of this is about building this rebellion. And it seems like we're kind of building towards something, right? And then what happens is the first battle of this rebellion that the book has largely been centered around planning and launching. The rebellion is crushed, destroyed. It almost comes across like a punchline, like, here's this rebellion, no. So I look at that as almost like a theme of the novel, I guess, is you can't beat City Hall. Or perhaps I should say, the house always wins. The throne always wins. In a way, it's a depressing and demoralizing message, but it has its real world accuracy. There's forces none of us can beat, even if we want to. I think whatever your stances on various issues and causes and public figures are, I think you can find some agreement, some depressing agreement in that. So I was reading that thinking, it seems almost like the end of this battle when they just ride into that town square and there's cannons waiting for them, and all the rebel leaders are either blown apart there or hanged immediately after the first battle of this rebellion. There's some theming going on there. There's a little something about, nope, the house always wins. You can't beat City Hall. Granted, it probably could have gone differently if they had a few factors. If the Breakers had joined in the way they were supposed to, if Ricky had joined in the way she was supposed to, if they had attacked the night before instead of waiting for the 2 extra regiments to get forward, they could have at least killed or deposed Orso, and that would have changed things, but they didn't. So, yeah. It's not the only theme in the book. Each of the 3 parts starts with kind of an epigraph of sorts, a little quote, something like that. I believe there was later on no plan survives contact with the enemy, something about 3 can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. But I think the key one for the premise of this book was the very first one, which said, I wrote this down, in times of peace, the warlike man attacks himself. That's really what the book is about, isn't it? The Union was not at peace for long before it came in and attacked itself. Thankfully, real-world politics don't play that much of a theme in the book. I read some early reviews that I said I think this about a little hatred as well. I guess it just kind of shows that maybe I should find some book review websites to read that politicize things a little less, that seem to suggest that real-world politics had stronger parallels in this book than they really do, which I was relieved they don't really. The first chapter was a little ominous in this regard. They were bringing up real world. They were the minimum wage, and then the closed council was like, "Oh no, not the workers." And I was like, eh. And let's kind of scale it back a little bit. The worst moment in the entire novel is one moment, I can't remember. I think it might be Lord Aisher or Berezin. One of them, probably Aisher, says, we'll make the Union great again. I was like, oh, no, we don't save your cringe. If I was the editor, I would have put a line through that and wrote cringe beside it. That was an unfortunate moment, but fortunately, it doesn't play out like each side of the rebellion represents one side of real world politics. If anything, they both are kind of anti-worker types. So I don't know. Read it however you want, but fortunately, it's not super strong real world political parallels. I was worried about it towards the beginning of the book, but as it goes on, that kind of fades away to basically nothingness, which I was fortunate about because it's cringe. Doesn't matter how good an author's plotting, action scenes, dialogue are. It's cringe 100% of the time. Thankfully, that's not what the novel's about. What the novel is also not really about, interestingly, compared to A Little Hatred, is the industrialization that seemed like a huge, just the constant descriptions of Adua, the scaffolding, the construction, the chimneys, the smoke. It's not retconned by any means here. It's discussed in the Darling, the slums chapter gets into that, but it's definitely de-emphasized. It's more about war again, as opposed to the mechanization of society. I wonder if that's why the last book actually changed its title. It was book 3 of the Age of Madness was going to be called The Beautiful Machine, which I liked. It really seemed to tie the industrialization, mechanization themes together. But if that's not really what the trilogy is about anymore, I guess it's the wisdom of crowds now, which I guess is more about mobs. But we'll see. I kind of like the old title, but we'll see how it works. Point of discussion number 8, pacing and writing. Pretty important to a book, isn't it, writing? And yeah, Joe Abercrombie's a damn good writer, always has been. That's why I like the book so much, especially the initial trilogy. Still fun, still funny for supposedly a grimdark fantasy series. There's plenty of laughs here. Still quotable, still quick. And when I say quick, I mean quick. In a genre that's high fantasy, that's I would say famous or infamous for a little bit of bloviation, long-windedness, inflated page counts. This book, it blows through things real quickly. I mean, real quick. Like it's a page turner. I mean, it's a good sense. It also skips over events that I kind of would have liked to have seen, like the election of the leaving the Union or not in Westport. There's so much build up to it, but we don't actually see the actual election take place. By the way, that whole bit at the beginning is a little strangely paced, isn't it? We have all these it almost reads like a novella of these Vicky chapters setting up this Westport election. Then it's never mentioned again it's never mentioned again for the rest of the book. It reminds me of old Simpsons episodes back from when the show was watchable, when they would have the first act of the episode would be something completely different, then it would go into other stuff. Same with Ricky to some extent, but the Long Eye stuff is at least brought up again through the novel. The Westport election stuff seems strangely detached. But yeah, that's the actual vote casting itself is skipped. The wedding of Leo and Savina skipped. I would have liked to have seen that. I feel like the cause of rebellion is skipped. I did not believe that this Wetterlint chode bag being hanged for his rape and murder would inspire tens of thousands of men to rise up in rebellion against the king. If you were to try to tell me that Orso was perceived as a weak, corrupt, or bad king, I would have liked to have seen a little more of that. Yeah, in a genre that's so associated with long-windedness, I think this book could have been 50 to even 100 pages longer, and it actually might have been a good thing. Would have allowed us to expand a few things that I wanted to see and that I think we needed to see about setting up this rebellion convincingly. There were some things I didn't mind too much not having, though. There was less romance, there was less love triangle, there was less a love square in this one compared to A Little Hatred, which I was a little relieved by. I felt like toward the end of A Little Hatred, it leaned into that Orso, Savine, Leo, or Ricky love square a little too much. I'm not saying it didn't play a role here. Jealousy, again, from Orso towards Leo and Savine played a role, but it was a little de-emphasized. And that'll bring us to point number 9 of discussion, conclusion of both the book and of my thoughts about the book. So, as I mentioned before, I wasn't even thinking about the Weaver by the end of this book because the Breakers stuff felt pretty de-emphasized to me. Yeah, Broad went in to talk to them. They hit up that wagon, right? But it compared to the previous book, Little Hatred, it felt like 90% reduction in the emphasis on the Breakers and then the Burners and Judge and Reese Now and all that. But yeah, they're back, and it's the setup for the third book is clearly for them to take center stage with the burning of Valentin Balk, the new branch in Valbeck. And I have to think that that's how we bring Baez back into this. He's not going to sit and stand idly while bank after bank is burned down by the Breakers, right? So yeah, is we setting up Baez versus Pike for the end of the this whole sequence? That would be surprising, wouldn't it? I mean, it was already surprising enough when it turned out this somewhat minor but interesting enough kind of military supporting character Pike, before they are hanged, and the last argument of the Kings was actually Salem Ruse. But to go back and read the Blade itself and think that Salem Ruse, who we meet as this fat guy getting tortured by Glokta in like the second chapter, is the big, this big bad in a sense, or co-big bad with Baez of this saga. That'd be interesting to think of, wouldn't it? Yeah, so I guess that's clearly a setup for the third book, although seeing as I did not predict any of this Civil War stuff coming, I certainly can't say that I, can predict everything in the third book. So I'll tell you what I thought was going to be a focus of the third book right up until near the end of the last 20 pages. This one was Stour versus Ricky in the north, but then Clover betrayed him and stabbed, Clover's men stabbed Stour's men. They slashed up Stour's knees. He ain't fighting no more. He ain't no swordsman no more. He was like, I'm the best swordsman in the world. And they cripple him, possibly for life. So, yeah, that's pretty interesting. I don't know. Now I don't know where the North story is going to go. I got no fucking clue at this point. Yeah, that whole twist, by the way, was it's the second book in this trilogy in a row that's ended with a kind of a surprise sneak attack mass slaughter in the last Clover chapter, isn't it? I guess that's becoming the Clover cliche. We're gonna do that again in the third book. So yeah, reading that, I have no clue what's gonna happen in the North in book 3 with Stour and Ricky and Clover. Couldn't even begin to predict it. So all I really can see as going on is the Breakers. And I guess the future of Leo and Savine will be interesting. It seems Savine is possibly been pardoned by her role because she's sitting in the audience with Orso at the end watching the hangings. To be honest, as someone who's probably as against hangings as Orso, by all rights, she probably should be up there too. The deaths of those thousands of men, she played a key role in organizing, but okay. But yeah, so Leo is all crippled up, survived. I was kind of predicting he would be pardoned at the end. They kind of tricked me for a split second into thinking we were going to have a character that major in one of these books actually die in his own viewpoint chapter, but it didn't happen. He lives. I assume they'll need to, he was saying, I'm sorry at the end. I'm sorry, right? So I would hope that he'll want to make up for what he's done and maybe help the Union somehow. So maybe they'll find a way to do that. Maybe he'll be we had Glokta, he was a great swordsman and he was crippled and found a role. Maybe Leo will find a similar role. Hopefully not just as a torturer, but yeah, so I'm sure Leo will have to play some role in the third book. Don't know what it'll be, but something. But if we're approaching the end of this trilogy, there has to be more Baez in the third book. I would hope so. I would be disappointed if there wasn't, which means there must be a bit more magic, right? Or are we scaling magic out of this whole world? Yeah, but I do hope to see a little bit more Baez if we're going to the end of things, especially if it's going to be the last book of this sequence, either the last first law book ever, or at least the last one for a good while. I want a little bit more of a Baez presence. And that'll about bring us to the end of this discussion, I guess. I will admit that if I'm ranking all 9 first law books, this might come a little on the lower end of things, maybe as low as 7 or even 8, right above Sharp Ends. Maybe 7 above the Heroes. I probably found it more interesting than the Heroes. Some fans don't like Red Country as much. I actually kind of fucking love Red Country. It might be my number 4 after the original trilogy, which are still my favorites. Guess just some fondness for the Western genre and for Logan Ninefingers' presence. But yeah, I don't know. I was a little underwhelmed by Leo and Savine, the things they did in the book, and the fact that we were just right back into the war. I even said in my little hatred review a year ago, I hope that the next book isn't just the North attacking Midderland again, or isn't just the North attacking the Union again, and it kind of was. It was the North and England combined attacking, which was a little twist, not quite what I was talking about, not quite what I meant. But nevertheless, yeah, it was about the North attacking the Union again. And I guess I'm kind of a little bit over that. I'd like to explore some different parts of the world, some different themes. But it looks like we'll be back into the Breakers. So hopefully we'll get another trilogy sometime. I want to see... I liked exploring the edges of the world and the standalones. I want to go back to some of those places. But yeah, I did like Orso a lot. I continue to really like, the dialogue, the mood, the darkness, the humor of it, the prose, the action scenes. I certainly wasn't bored reading this book. I went through it at a quick clip. When I picked it up, I would easily go through plenty of chapters in every sitting with it. But overall, I guess I wanted something a little different, I have to admit. I guess I wanted a Goku Vegeta-esque saga with Leo and Stour, and that just wasn't what it was about. We just... got right back into the war. So, I don't know. I'm a little worn out, I guess. Guess I'm a little bit of a hypocrite because I have a war in my own kind of fantasy thing I'm trying to write. But I don't know. Maybe I should find a way to scale back that too. But yeah, I don't know. To some extent, I found it maybe not quite what I wanted. A little underwhelming in that sense. But certainly, I'm not saying that I won't pick up the Wisdom of Crowds when it comes out. I'll order it day one, just like I ordered this one day one, just like I ordered a Little Hatred day one. But overall, I'd hope to see maybe some character development in positive directions in the next book. But and maybe something besides another big war sequence in Midderland, because I feel like we pretty well done that by now. I want something a little different in book 3. I would really like that. So yeah, I got some issues. I would say I liked it. I was entertained by it, but I can't necessarily in all honesty say that I loved The Trouble with Peace. Just liked it. We'll go with that. But I had a few little issues. But so yeah, that'll about wrap it up, I guess, for this discussion though. If you watch this, feel free to hop down in the comments. If you totally disagree with me or something, that's cool. Agree with me, that's cool too. Let me know where you think some of the characters might go, what might be in store for Leo, what might be in store for the Breakers, Baez, everything First Law, everything Age of Madness, everything Wisdom of Crowds. Feel free to chip in with your thoughts. And, well, I'm recording pretty late into the night here, so I guess I'll say peace out for now, and I'll see y'all back at the book club again real soon. And at least in a year, I'll be back with a review of Wisdom of Crowds. Maybe I'll try to sneak in some First Law reviews between now and then. All right. Later, everyone.